Thank you everyone for joining us for another Learning Lunch hosted by FormatApproved.com. My name is Brian Johnson. I'm the Senior Director of Online Education with Format Approved, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's Learning Lunch will cover the HIPAA One-Day Training Challenge.
Very exciting.
We're joined today by Wendy Whitmore, who's the CIO of Format Approved. Wendy has an incredible depth of experience in health IT and online training, so she brings a unique perspective to successful compliance education. Thank you for joining us today, Wendy.
Thank you for inviting me.
Remember that you can ask questions of us at any time during today's session by entering them into the chat area during the presentation. In the second half of our session, we will address as many questions as time allows. Also, remember that all registered attendees of today's session will receive an email with links to both the slides and the recorded version of the event. So people often ask us during this session if they can get the slides. Rest assured that we will send those out to you after the event. All right, let's get right into it. So Wendy, give us some perspective on why HIPAA training is so important.
Well, you know, I feel like we address this question in every single HIPAA webinar that we do. So for all of you who have prior attended our various HIPAA webinars on alternate topics, bear with me for just one moment. But what we are learning in our business here at Format Approved is that as the HIPAA Omnibus deadline passed and as people are becoming more aware of the fact through their practice managers and other consultants that they work with, that they are in need of some HIPAA updates, as it were, to their various security and compliance programs. One of the things that I think falls by the wayside in many cases is an understanding that all medical practices and all covered entities and all business associates, anybody who has any contact with PHI, protected health information, is required by this HIPAA regulation to have training to understand these privacy and security regulations as it relates to their job. And, you know, in many cases, like I said, we're talking to healthcare professionals from day to day and learning that they are not completely up to speed on the fact that they need this type of training in order to comply.
Yeah, I think, you know, we talk to medical practices a good bit, and I think there's just a lot of confusion about what exactly HIPAA requires. And training is one of those things that should be first on the list, but often gets overlooked. Certainly, we've seen a lot of uptick in activity around business associates. That's one of the big changes, is that the Omnibus Final Rule requires those business associates to all have training if any of them come into contact with PHI. So that's certainly one area that's changed. Right. But even many of the covered entities, the providers who have been required to have training for a long time, aren't necessarily getting it.
Well, they're not, or they're doing it in such a way that, you know, it's not a sufficient amount of training, it's not a sufficient level of training, and because the regulations have changed since the Omnibus rules, it is sort of incumbent upon most medical environments to make sure that they're up to date and that they actually understand what those changes are and how they affect their practice or their environment. And additionally, the other piece, and I mention it in this slide, is just that, you know, it is important that we protect patient health information. We're noticing a lot of breaches and reports of various breaches happening through medical environments and medical practices. And I don't think any of those breaches, or at least most of them, don't seem to be intentional in any way. I think it's accidental in that they're not fully grasping what those regulations require of them to protect that data. And so those breaches are happening almost by accident in many cases.
Yeah, and often, you know, we'll probably get into more examples later, but often it's a matter of improper handling of mobile data.
Correct.
It so often comes down to that.
Absolutely.
So what's the idea behind a one-day challenge?
Well, again, we do a lot of, and I have a history in the HIT and consulting business around healthcare technology with medical professionals and hospitals and medical practices. And one of the things I do know as a former consultant is that medical practices and medical environments in general basically don't want to do this. I mean, let's be honest, right? This is not fun. This is not a fun topic. This is not something that everybody goes, hooray, it's the day that we have to learn HIPAA. It's not fun. And so my theory around this as an educator, and that is sort of where I'm at in my current career and have been for many, many years, my theory as an educator that has proved out as a successful concept is to bring this type of education, this dense compliance information, to people in a way that gets them excited about it potentially, or at the very least makes them less annoyed. And that's kind of the idea behind this one-day challenge, the idea that you can consolidate the training of a group or a staff in a way that is bringing them all to compliance in a single day. And for whatever reason, if you can work these steps and pull this project together, it is a great way to knock out this rather annoying task in a relatively with a relatively low level of frustration.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. I know that if I showed up and there was going to be this sounds sort of like a HIPAA training festival. I would actually be excited.
Well, you're strange anyway.
Yeah,
you spend way too much time talking about HIPAA.
I don't know what everyone else is thinking, but I think this is going to be a great Wednesday.
All right, so basically the idea behind this one-day training challenge is to get your staff, your group, your organization all on one page and get them all focused on knocking out or taking care of their familiarity with these regulations in a sort of a high intensity format. In the same way that you might do like a boot camp, or that you might do, what do they call those when somebody's trying to learn a foreign language in a day? What's that?
Immersion.
Immersion, yeah. So it's like HIPAA immersion. So, so the concept here is an 8-step process where you do a little bit of planning. You make sure you've gotten a compliance officer, which is a requirement, by the way. Make sure that they're prepared. Select your dates, do some promotion, make it exciting, etc. And we'll sort of go through each one of these steps as we talk here.
So let's start with the first step then. What does it mean to plan ahead for this thing?
Well, you know, where obviously the idea behind the one-day challenge is that you're going to get your staff excited and you're going to get them fired up. There is some planning that needs to happen. It's not like absolutely everybody and everything can happen in one day. That is partly because there are different levels of training required for different levels of engagement on this topic. So for instance, in our training platform, we have 2 different levels of training. We have a level of training that is designed specifically for the compliance officer, obviously a lot more information for the compliance officer, and that training takes quite a bit longer to complete. So my recommendation is that you identify the compliance officer in your environment and you make sure that that person is trained in advance of this one-day challenge idea. The reason behind that is twofold. One is that you're going to make sure that that person is fully up to speed on the topic so that they can help engage the rest of the staff in guiding them, assisting them, answering questions potentially as they go through their version of the training, and also so that they are not attempting to do 8 hours of training on the same day that everybody else is trying to get through too. So if you can identify that person, and we'll talk about that step in a moment, you know, planning ahead is kind of an important component. Make sure that you've reviewed the various ways that you might provide training to those folks. Confirm that it's verifiable for audit purposes. That's an important one. If you were to be audited, is this a type of training that that auditor can validate or verify, either with some sort of certification, some kind of online tracking, etc. And make sure that the training itself that you're going to be rolling out to those individual staff members is something that can be monitored and reviewed, so that when that compliance officer is engaging in this one-day challenge idea, they're able to see the process that everybody is going through and make sure that they're getting through the training and getting the answers to the questions that they might have along the way. So
no insult to this, you know, honorable venue here, but maybe sitting around and watching a webinar is not adequate to meet your HIPAA training. And from our experience, either webinars or quickie slideshows, that sort of thing is very common in HIPAA training.
Correct.
And it's not adequate.
It's not. And the main reason that it's not is that, you know, I don't know about you, but in general, if I'm sitting through a webinar, I'm not necessarily going to retain all of the information that's being pumped at me via PowerPoint. I'm potentially going to be half asleep during part of that, off to the restroom during part of that, and, you know, checking my text messages during part of that. And so therefore, I don't know that I would feel confident that I could validate that everybody really was understanding that topic all the way through, if that's the way you're presenting it.
Right, and then there's the follow-up question. Is there an assessment associated with it?
Right.
What is the nature of that assessment? I mean, sometimes it might be 3 really easy questions.
How do you spell HIPAA?
We've actually heard of one that asks how many letters are in the word HIPAA.
That's bad. That's a bad test question.
Completely pointless for everyone. So the question is, can you really assess that people have paid attention and actually demonstrate that they understand their basic obligations under HIPAA?
Exactly.
So next, select a leader. What's involved here?
Okay, well, this is actually, as far as I'm concerned, not just for the one-day challenge, but in general, anybody who's looking to comply with HIPAA and to make sure that they're meeting those regulation requirements around the compliance officer. This is really a serious component of this particular program, but also of HIPAA in general. And that is to identify your in-house compliance officer. Every environment needs to have a compliance officer, whether you're a 1-doc practice or a 10-doc practice or a clinic or a hospital. This compliance officer role is required.
And for business associates too now.
Exactly.
So if you're a business associate, meaning that you come into contact with PHI, IT service provider, cloud-based storage, whatever business associate you are, you also must have a compliance officer.
That is correct. And identifying the right person for this role is kind of an important step. And so I'm going to just take a couple of extra moments to talk about this. First of all, you want this person to be a good, solid team leader. If this is not a good team, if this is simply somebody who's kind of geeky and into security, I'm not sure that that's going to be the best identification of a compliance officer in your environment. I, as a consultant, would rather see you select someone who has a high level of interest in the compliance component, if that's possible in your environment. But I would say the main quality in this person should be that they're a very good team leader, partly because this person is going to be responsible for making sure that everybody else in your environment is up to speed on this topic. And if they're not a good team leader, if they're not someone that everybody tends to relate to and talk to, it's probably going to be difficult for them to make sure that everybody is getting on board, as it were, with the compliance topic.
Well, I think that, that goes for a lot of people who are feeling that you call them a leader, might also call them a champion of sorts.
Right.
That champion needs to be someone who can actually move other people to take an interest in the subject and take it seriously.
Right, or at least, somebody who is going to, have a certain amount of energy around it, right? Yeah.
Right.
I mean, that's the person you want. And making sure that that person trains in advance of the one-day challenge, in general, making sure that that person trains, period. That compliance officer role, that's quite a bit of information that that person needs to know. And I recommend, for a host of reasons, but I do recommend that they actually take some sort of course that does provide an assessment for them, because quite frankly, although there is a lot of information about HIPAA on the internet and that you can Google and that you can find at various regulatory sites, it is very expansive, and what a compliance officer needs to know is very specific. So you can read hundreds, and how many pages are in the omnibus reg?
583 or something like that.
Right, 583 pages. So nobody wants to read that. I don't want to read that. And I'm in education, so I can imagine that somebody who's been assigned the role of compliance officer really, really doesn't want to have to read 500 plus pages.
And the good news is they don't need to.
That's
they
right.
need to understand what's relevant to them and to the medical practice or business associate as it may be, but they don't need to read that entire body of regulations. They just need to know what they need to know.
Right, exactly.
And good training for that compliance officer will provide that.
Exactly. Exactly. So those are when you select a leader, you want to make sure that you've selected somebody that really can help to fire up your team. You want to make sure this person is involved in the planning of your challenge day, obviously. But prior to all of that, you want to make sure that this person is fully trained themselves so that they're up to speed. I know that our compliance officer course takes about 8 hours, so that's the kind of course that you might want to take over the course of a weekend or over the course of several days to make sure that you've got all of the information and have it absorbed, at a high level before you start this process.
And I'll just add real quick that what we see quite a bit of is people, the practice doesn't really know what they need to do. They've done some things, but they're not really sure what all they need to do to be compliant. They get that compliance officer in and they take that course, then they do know, because that person then has done the training necessary to understand, oh, we need a risk analysis. We're missing this piece.
Right.
And so that really, then that person becomes the leader also for your internal deliberations of, oh, well, we need to do this as well.
Correct. Exactly.
So selecting a date's obviously critical to getting one of these set up.
It is.
What should they consider?
Well, it's funny because this slide maybe seems a little self-evident, but you know, it is interesting. One of the challenges to the one-day challenge concept is that it is difficult to get everybody in one room at the same time, and so selecting a date that is doing a couple of things can be very important to making this a successful concept, which means choosing a date and time that is not going to interfere with patient care. Obviously, that's important. I know with a lot of medical practices, they will have a day of the week that they focus or work on paperwork, for instance. I know that happens in a lot of practices. In other medical environments, there might be a day of the week that they've got part of the day identified for staff meetings, etc. Try to work it around those dates if you can. The other option, and in addition, depending upon the size and scope of the staff, what you may want to make sure that you can do, and we'll talk about this in a moment as well, is that regardless of the date and time that you select, make sure that you've got various options for people to complete the training in this challenge day. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But try not to interfere with patient care. Try not to interfere with staff free time, because again, we're talking about something that nobody wants to do, and you're going to say, hey, Saturday afternoon at 1 o'clock. Don't do that, because nobody wants to take HIPAA training.
Good news, everybody. We're canceling the holiday.
Exactly. Don't do that. It sounds self-evident, but crazier things have happened, and I thought it was worthwhile to mention that it's helpful for your compliance officer to plan ahead to choose a date that's working for most people.
All right, so what do they need to think through in terms of promoting the event then?
Well, and this kind of falls in line with the whole one-day challenge concept, which is you want to promote this as an event. Make it something that people are looking forward to. How do you do that? Because, of course, nobody's going to look forward to sitting down and spending a couple of hours, drumming through regulatory compliance training. And I'm an educator, and I have, helped to build a lot of this training, and Brian has as well, and he jokes that he enjoys HIPAA training. But the truth of the matter is nobody is going to love spending the afternoon learning about HIPAA. But by the same token, if you can figure out a way to promote it so that the folks that are going to be involved in this challenge understand that there's some positive around it, and we'll talk about that as well, I think if you can figure out how to promote it that way, you're going to get a much higher level of engagement and level of interest in the process.
So let's talk about how to incentivize people.
Right. And medical environments around some of these topics, for the most part, it's interesting. I think, and what I hear a lot from our medical site visitors and the people that attend various of our webinars and trainings is that, they need to know this stuff. They get that they need to know this stuff. They understand that there are regulatory requirements and potential audits around some of these things. But what they don't 100% get is how to make it happen so that not everybody is grumbling at them. One way to do that is to make, as I mentioned, if you're going to make this an event or create some sort of event around this, combine it with donut breakfast or something healthier. I don't know. Pizza party, ice cream, so that all sounds fattening. But some other incentive. Come up with some kind of incentive plan. It doesn't have to be that complicated. The truth of the matter is what we learn about some of these, these one-day challenges that we recommend and mount is that it doesn't really take a lot of incentive to get people interested in it. It's not a huge it's a couple of hours of their day or of their time. If you sweeten the deal even just a little bit with something really simple, there's a chance that your level of engagement will be quite a bit higher.
So why does it matter how the training is delivered? Why is it good that there be an online component to it?
Well, again, it really depends on the size of your staff and about the availability of everybody. The minute you're talking about 5 or 6 or 10 people, trying to get them all into the one room at the same time, even to do a webinar or a PowerPoint or whatever it is, whatever version that you're going to spin on this training day, if you have an on-site and online comparable option, then you're going to get a much higher level of engagement. So my point is, if somebody's homesick today, or if they're home with their child, or they're off for today, or they're off for this week, and you have selected a date, or your compliance officer has selected a date where not everybody can be in during that 2 or 3 hours of time, this is a great way to make sure that they're still participating, making sure that for that time period they could log in remotely, whether it's to a webcam to watch what you guys are doing in the room, or whether it's into an online training program so that they can actually go through the same exact course structure as everybody else at the same time. It is helpful if you can do either an online or an on-site or both, because that does give you a lot more flexibility, and it's going to give you a much higher level of engagement on this event.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that you get the best of both worlds with that, because part of what's good about doing the one-day challenge is, for one thing, you get your challenge done, you know that everybody's completed it. It's also an awareness tool, and HIPAA awareness is important. So if you sort of dedicate a day to it, then everybody is aware that they need to do the training, but also that HIPAA is important. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, the traditional model is to get everybody on a plane or send them off somewhere to do a boot camp. There's a lot of drawbacks to that, obviously, because it takes everyone out off the schedule and out. But then also, even if people miss that day, it's great to have another option there, because otherwise, it doesn't matter if someone's sick that day, they still have to have their HIPAA training. So if they can have self-paced online training to catch up on that, that's a great option to have as well. Yeah. So you get the best of both worlds.
Agreed.
So people are naturally competitive. How can you use competition to spur people on?
Well, I mean, I think this works on a lot of different levels. It certainly has worked in my experience to create some kind of competition or contest around the one-day challenge. The reason we call it a challenge is because the idea behind the challenge is to get the compliance officer to challenge the staff to get this training done in a high-speed, all-encompassing format. So that's one challenge. Obviously, that's you to your compliance officer, or you as your compliance officer, making sure that you've got these people participating and engaged and getting through it in this one-day format. However, that said, another way to get people fired up about participating in this one-day challenge is to come up with some kind of competition and reward scenario. So if you, for instance, designate a time frame, meaning anybody who, the person who finishes the course and gets the highest score first, or if they finish the course and get a passing score first, you can come up with some kind of reward for success. I have some recommendations from some folks who have gone through this one-day challenge concept and have done an extra paid day off for the employee who succeeds with both the highest rate of completion and the highest score on the final exam. The other part is to kind of like when you're at the carnival and you're playing the game where you shoot the gun into blows up the balloon, or the guy's running along the way, and you can see the progress. It gets other people fired up. They can see that other people are moving along the path, and they can see that, so advertising the fact that, hey, John is in the lead, Sally's in the lead. If you can advertise that fact, you can sometimes get people more engaged in that process as well. And then making sure that you make a big deal out of announcing who the winners are and congratulating them at the end, awarding them, a silly little medal, or whatever, a certificate for their extra day off, or something exciting like that. Again, the idea here is to get some buzz around it and make it exciting.
Yeah, and it often doesn't take much. It just gets people socially engaged. Is that, if I'm competing against an office mate, it's just kind of fun that way.
Right, it just makes it more fun. Something boring and annoying becomes fun.
For me, I would give anyone who took a piece of pizza, I'd give them the side on if they hadn't, I don't know if I believe that you're really getting through it, Jimmy.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so then you talked a little bit about how, you need to celebrate success. Tell us more about what's involved there.
All right, well, it's nothing involved. Again, this is a recommendation based on my experiences and my recommendations to certain clients around this challenge concept, which is assuming that your whole group gets through it within that challenge period. So you've created the challenge at the beginning, or your compliance officer has done so, and they've said, if everybody completes by noon today, we will have a pizza lunch or whatever it is. You know, again, this is really similar to the last slide, which is create some kind of goal around it. And if they accomplish it, make sure they know that you appreciate it, that you appreciate that they've done it, that they've gotten through it, that somebody has, you know, been the ultimate winner, but that everybody wins because it basically was something that they needed to do, but that they did it with enthusiasm, and they've done it, you know, in the time frame that you earmarked for this project.
And handing out the certificates has a dual purpose in that you give people a tangible, you know, it's a real sign that they finished the training, but then also it's documentation that they finished the training as well.
Right.
And that shouldn't just be something that you hand to them and then forget about in terms of your own documentation. You've got to keep that documentation for 5 years on HIPAA, I believe is the figure.
That's right.
So that should be, we believe that's something that you need to keep track of online as well as in paper documentation. It should be in their file.
Right.
But you want to have multiple ways of documenting that they completed that training if there ever was any question about it.
Absolutely.
All right, so we're to our Q&A section of the session. We have plenty of time for that. So we, Wendy and I both work regularly with the HIPAA community and welcome your questions on any aspect of HIPAA, whether it's training or anything else. And if we don't know the answer, we'll fess up to it and get back to you in a written response after consulting with people who are at the highest level of the mountaintop on HIPAA. We know some folks who know HIPAA to an astonishing degree, but we usually are able to address questions that people have about it. So feel free to ask those questions. I'm going to go ahead and ask the first one, and then we'll just decide which of us is going to take it. The question is, what should I do if my MSP does not believe they need to sign a business associate agreement?
Well, first of all, let's talk about what an MSP is, because I'm not sure that everybody knows what that means.
Okay.
So managed service provider is what MSP stands for. What that means is anybody who works with your technology in your practice or your IT. Anybody who works with your IT and technology is somebody that, particularly at a managed services level, is considered an MSP, but also IT folks fall into this rule regulation area as well, which is, do those folks need to sign a business associate agreement? If they don't have one, what can you do? My answer to that is you've got a couple of options. Quite frankly, in order to comply with HIPAA, if you have a technology professional and they are not willing to sign a business associate agreement, unfortunately the answer to that is going to be that you need to find a different IT professional, because really to comply, if those folks are going to be inside your computers where you've got an electronic health record or you've got some billing software that tracks patient health information, if that person isn't going to sign a business associate agreement, then you're going to need to replace that person.
Right, and I just add to that, the easiest way, because sometimes people are questioning, you know, who's a business associate and who isn't. The basic rule on that is, do they come into contact with protected health information, which is health information that can be identified by the patient. So anyone who's providing IT support to you, who's going into your computers and maintaining them, they are a business associate under the law because they're coming into contact with that information. And that means that they have to comply with HIPAA to the same extent as a provider does. And that's really one of the changes in the law that people are still catching up on. So if your business associate is saying, well, you know, we've never had to do this in the past, or if they say, well, our compliance is through you, the covered entity, that is the way the rules used to read. So that's an important thing to understand, is that those rules have changed. It used to be that the business associate, as long as the covered entity was in compliance, then the business associate was in compliance. But that is no longer the case. The business associate must be in compliance independently of the covered entity. A follow-up issue that we often get asked about is, well, how can you even be sure? What if the business associate signs the agreement but then actually doesn't do anything, or doesn't seem to have any knowledge of HIPAA? And that sometimes comes up as well. I think part of it is you need to ensure that that business associate understands that the rules have changed and that they need to get educated themselves. The easiest way to check is to say to them, well, why don't I get my compliance officer in touch with your compliance officer? And if they say,
Right.
compliance who?
Right, then you know that
you know that they don't.
participating.
And if they do have a compliance officer, then that person should be able to tell you, oh yes, well we have policies in place, we've had a risk analysis, whatever it is that your concerns may be, you can get those answers then. All right, we do have another question that we'll go to. What exactly are the documentation requirements for staff training? If we do individual employee sign-off sheets, what information needs to be on these sheets to document our compliance with the training requirements?
Well, the truth of the matter is, as the regulation reads, the sign-off sheet is really simply that employee is documenting or validating that they have received the training, and that does need to appear in their employee record. In the new universe of HIPAA regulatory requirements, all of the documentation really does need to be in a living document, meaning that it's got to be a spot, a place where there's some audit trail and there's some capability for any auditing entity to be able to see when that document, when that training was completed, where that document sits in the employee record, when it was issued in the employee record, etc. But as far as what detailed individual training happened on that signature page, those two things aren't necessarily tied together, to my knowledge.
Right. So, and why do we talk about the need to have an online verification of that training? Well, for a couple of reasons. One is that, of course, unfortunately, documentation often gets lost. If you're talking about a piece of paper that's in an employee record, hopefully that shouldn't be misplaced in any way, but it happens all the time. And for something like HIPAA compliance, it really matters, because if you're talking about a breach investigation or an audit, you don't want shoddy training. And people have been fined large sums of money for not having adequate training programs.
Correct.
You don't want to leave anything up to chance with a paper that could be misplaced. If you've got online verification of that is kept in a compliant environment, then you can say, even if that documentation is missing, well, here, auditor, I can confirm in this way also that the training has been completed.
Right.
The other aspect of it is that it's not enough to get trained once. HIPAA requires periodic updating of that training. And so through an automated process, if you're doing online training, you can get prompts then sent to you that say, it's been a year since you last got trained. And then you know that you need to go about either planning another one-day challenge, or however you go about it, you know that you need to get that training updated for everyone. Because if an audit happens and they come in and you haven't trained anyone in 3 years, you're in trouble. You have not done the training that you need to do that.
Right. And those signature pages aren't enough. I mean, I think the part that I find funny is we've actually heard from certain environments that they hand out signature pages to the staff, expecting them to get the training on their own in some way, shape, or form, and then they assume that when the staff says they've done it and they sign off on that sheet of paper that that's adequate. That is not adequate.
Right, and this is of a piece with so much that's in HIPAA. So, for instance, you need to have HIPAA-compliant policies, policies that demonstrate that you're actually complying with the security rule. Having the policies in and of themselves is not enough. And we hear this from, it's the Office for Civil Rights that enforces HIPAA. They talk about this a good bit. Having policies is not enough. They actually have to be followed. And it's the same thing with training, just handing out sign-in sheets, and then
Yeah.
Everyone is trained because they signed this piece of paper.
Right.
If they start to dig into that and there's no real training there, and presumably if they're looking at you, it may well be because you had a breach, which could well be caused by not having training.
Exactly.
They're not going to just take a sign-in sheet as adequate demonstration of that. Well, let's look. Oh, we just have a comment here. So someone is advising us that the training should require the date of training, the topics covered, the name of the trainer, the length of the training, and the certificate if provided. That's all certainly good advice.
Well, but that's all true. That's not really what we were responding to. We were responding to the question regarding the signature page that is required in the employee record. Yes, you're right that if from a training standpoint, there does need to be some verifiable backup to that signature page. What I was commenting on is in many cases the medical environment thinks that the signature page is enough in and of itself, and it is not. So that's a good list of things that are required or necessary, including that there needs to be an audit trail that shows the date of the training, the topics that were covered, how the training was presented, etc. So all of those things are important. All of those things are provided through most verifiable online documentation training programs, etc. But if you're going to be doing it in-house, for instance, with that passive webinar, as we mentioned, there does need to be quite a bit of documentation of that training exercise around the completion of that training by those folks.
All right, here we have another question from our audience. What do we need to do around mobile devices? You mentioned that earlier.
Oh, that's interesting.
So here's one of the things that is very simple, and if practices and medical organizations would do this, it would prevent most of the breaches that we hear about, although certainly not all. And the issue is, if you're, especially any device that can be moved, whether it's a laptop or if you're doing any kind of handling of PHI through your phone, or one that gets people a lot is through flash drives, that sort of thing, you really need to have that data that's on there encrypted. And the reason why is HIPAA doesn't require the encryption, but the HITECH Act, which is, you know, really the reason why we're talking about all these changes to HIPAA, the HITECH Act was passed in 2009, had a lot of different things in there about EHR adoption. People know, you know, meaningful use comes from that act as well. But it also changed HIPAA quite a bit, and that's why the implementation of that is what the Omnibus Final Rule really is doing, that was issued earlier this year. So the point here is that the HITECH Act specifically exempts from breach reporting devices that were encrypted. And what that means is that if there was a case in Nebraska where a doctor, I believe, went running and had a flash drive with 2,000 health records. He just had it around his neck, and as these things do, you know, the thing. Just a moment, excuse me. As these things do, the magnetic clasp on the device didn't hold. It fell off, and that's a breach. So they had to report that, and because it's more than 500 health records, that practice went on the wall of shame, horrible publicity for them. Right. I mean, really a fairly innocent mistake. It could happen to anyone, except for the fact that if that staff had proper training in HIPAA, they would know that it is absolutely crazy to take any kind of mobile device with 2,000 health records on it if that device is unencrypted, and then go out into the world and wait for accidents to happen. That's how people keep getting into trouble. The other thing is, you don't even necessarily have to take your mobile data anywhere. We had a big breach here in the Illinois area of just an astonishing number of health records. I will do the organization a favor and not mention who they were, but you can easily look it up. And what happened to them is they had a couple of laptops stolen out of a building. Right. And those laptops contain huge numbers of health records. So, you know, if it's not something that, you know, that people need a truck to run off with, I mean, if you've got, like, you know, stable network in your office environment, you don't necessarily need to encrypt everything in it. But any kind of laptop or anything like that should definitely be encrypted, because, again, if the thieves, and they weren't looking for PHI, there's no evidence of that anyway, they just were trying to get laptops. If they had stolen a laptop that was encrypted, none of us would even know about it, because the law exempts that.
Absolutely. And I think, again, there's a lot of misconception about what is a breach, how the breaches happen, and which is exactly why training is important. If you don't, you know, at the workforce level, at the staff level, the training includes a lot of pragmatic information about how to avoid breaches, what breaches, you know, are important, you know, what constitutes a breach, etc. Those are the things that your staff need to understand. What things might they be doing using Google email to communicate with a patient, that sort of thing. What things might they be doing that could be constituting a breach?
Well, and that's a good point. I'm glad you mentioned the email, because we often get questions about that. Many practices, unfortunately, will still, you know, send protected health information through services like Gmail. That's definitely a no-no. Or they use non-HIPAA compliant texting. That's also not something that can be done. Those are in and of themselves breaches, with the exception when it comes to Gmail, if a patient demands that you send them their own protected health information through Gmail, and you explain that that's not a good idea, and they insist, then you can do it, but the thing to do is to document that you advise them it's a bad idea. Why is it a bad idea? Well, because these free email services mine that information to show you ads. It's not secure. It's not. It may be encrypted in terms of your communication with Google servers, but it's not the level of security that HIPAA demands. So if you send a third party that information through Gmail, which a lot of practices are still doing, that's a breach. And so if there was ever an audit or if that information got out, you would definitely be in trouble for that. So it's important to be sure that you're using the right technology. And as we move into stage 2 of meaningful use, everybody's trying to get their portals set up and make sure that their patients are beginning to use those. That's coming next year. The nice thing is that those portals provide a secure means of communication with your patients. So there's been a lot of progress on this, and I think the compliance environment for communicating with patients is going to get a lot better here in the next year. So as people are exploring that stage 2 of meaningful use, they should really look into how they can communicate with patients through those secure tools that are in the portal.
Absolutely. And again, this is really good, conversation around the fact that when your staff does take privacy and security training, they're going to get a lot of this information so that you make sure that they're not going to accidentally breach that patient information.
Right, because I think a lot of people wouldn't even necessarily think twice about using an email service like that unless they've been trained, and then they know that they should.
Correct. All right. Well, I think that's kind of a wrap-up on our current questions for this session. I know, Brian, you wanted to mention that from a training perspective, we wanted to offer some beneficial options for folks around the one-day training challenge from a training opportunity perspective.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that, first of all, thank you to all of our guests for joining us. Kind of a brief HIPAA training run through for you, but if you do need that HIPAA training and you're looking for a way to get started, we provide those services as we were talking about. We have the compliance officer training, which is the CHSP, we call that, and then we have workforce training, which is less than 2 hours, very pragmatic.
Relatively inexpensive.
Yes, priced in a way that you can train the whole office. But what I really want to mention is that we have a special offer now where as a special promotion for a limited time, if you go to the URL on your screen, that's www.formatapproved.com/education/courses_security.
Ooh, that's a lot.
I know, it's a mouthful. But
or
if
just
you
go to formattraining.com.
Yeah, just go to our store and click on HIPAA is another way of doing it. But regardless, you'll see there's a product in there right now called the Mini Compliance Bundle. It's the second one in there. If you choose that, you'll get a CHSP plus 2 free workforce for the price that you usually pay just for that CHSP. So we're having
2 free workforce level courses, exactly.
That's right. So if you need to catch up, you've been thinking, well, I really need to get my training done. The Omnibus Final Rule kicked in September and I haven't done it. This is a great opportunity to go ahead and do that. So visit that URL on your screen when we send you the slides, or just go to ForMed Training and you can get that, sign up for that training and get started right away. Or you can sign up and plan out your one-day training challenge.
One-day training challenge. And if you have any questions about the one-day training challenge, obviously this slide deck will come to you after this event, as well as the recorded version of the session if you want to just step through it again or shoot it off to somebody else that might need it. And we appreciate you guys paying attention, and hopefully this will be helpful to some groups.
Well, and we'd like to invite you to sign up for our upcoming webinars. We have quite a slate coming over the next 2 months. You can visit formatapproved.com to learn about those learning lunches and register. The Learning Lunch button on the bottom of that homepage will take you to our entire slate of upcoming webinars. Our next Learning Lunch will air on November 26th, and will cover the subject of HIPAA support services, how to identify the right consultant. So for those of you looking for guidance, maybe wanting to bring in a consultant to help you, this would be a great resource for you. Keep an eye on your email box on our homepage for other upcoming topics, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks, Brian.